for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing The Eternals, a movie based on a cast of characters that are so obscure that not even I have heard of them. To get an idea of how obscure they are, in my review of Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, I thought making a movie based on Shang-Chi was scraping the bottom of the barrel, but making a movie based on The Eternals is a whole nother level, to such a point that I honestly thought they were another group of characters called the Inhumans. Yeah, no joke, because back in 2015 when Phase 2 came into an end and Phase 3 was announced, we all knew the movies that were coming out for Phase 3. We all knew that Civil War was coming out, followed by Doctor Strange, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, the first MCU Spider-Man movie, which at the time didn't have the Homecoming subtitle, followed by Thor Ragnarok, Black Panther, Avengers Infinity War, Part 1, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Captain Marvel, and Avengers Endgame, which at the time was called Infinity War Part 2. And the final movie of Phase 3 that was supposed to end Phase 3 was originally going to be Inhumans. That was supposed to come out in July 12th of 2019. And keep in mind, Spider-Man Far From Home wasn't even greenlit yet because Marvel didn't know how everybody was going to react to the Tom Holland incarnation of Spider-Man. But as time progressed, that Inhumans movie never happened. And when Phase 4 was announced, Kevin Feige did announce that there was going to be another cosmic-themed movie, but it had nothing to do with the Guardians of the Galaxy. And the prevailing theory at the time was that everyone assumed that it was going to be the Inhumans, because for a period of time, Marvel really tried to push the Inhumans to the mainstream, giving them more frequent appearances in the comics, video games, and various appearances through television, both within the realm of animation through the various animated Marvel TV shows shown on Disney XD, along with the rather infamous live-action Inhumans TV show that was so infamous that it was canceled after one season, and what many consider to be the first real bad television series to be produced by Marvel Studios. And keep in mind, this was way before Disney Plus ever existed, and the only television shows that were considered to be the worst by fans at the time were Inhumans and the, at the time, first season of Iron Fist from Netflix. And with that out of the way, The Eternals would eventually premiere in 2021, and go on to become one of the most infamous installments of the MCU, to which not only do many consider to be one of the worst installments of the MCU, but it's also the very first installment of the MCU to get a rotten rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which at the time was really surprising given that most installments of the MCU have gained generally high praise from movie critics. Even some of the lesser installments of the MCU, such as The Incredible Hulk, Thor the Dark World, and Captain Marvel, get a Rotten Tomatoes score ranging from 60 to 70%, which is considered fresh, which led to the prevailing theory that Disney bought off a lot of movie critics to give a lot of their movies fresh scores on Rotten Tomatoes, until Eternals came out, which of course led to the movie becoming a box office hit because everybody was very curious about how bad was The Eternals. Which begs the question, is The Eternals really that bad? As for the plot of the movie, a group of immortal aliens, referred to as the Eternals, who had once shaped human civilization and saved it from a race of monstrous creatures referred to as the Deviants, go into hiding, vowing they would never interfere with mankind. Thousands of years later, and with Earth's population restored thanks to the Avengers, the Eternals must protect mankind once again when they discover that a small fraction of Deviants has survived. And as the Eternals continue their battle against the Deviants, they all soon discover a much bigger conspiracy going on that could potentially destroy the Earth itself. Can the Eternals save mankind once more, or will their continuing battle with the Deviants result in the Earth's destruction at the hands of a much more sinister force? Now, in terms of what I liked about the movie, unlike most other Marvel movies, I like the fact that this movie has a more serious tone in comparison to several other Marvel movies. in that sense where I would honestly compare it to something like the Black Panther movies, where yes, there's some bits of humor here and there, but I'll talk about that later. But for the most part, I do appreciate that the movie is more serious in tone. Another aspect of the movie I liked is that here's the first movie to properly introduce the Celestials, because technically we were kind of introduced to the Celestials in Guardians of the Galaxy, in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, with Ego technically being the first Celestial we actually get to meet on screen, even though Ego is not a Celestial in the comics. So I thought it was really cool to see, like, the actual Celestials in the movie itself. And in my opinion, I feel like the moment we get properly introduced to Arsharam and we see him telling his backstory along with some of the other Celestials, I honestly thought that was the best part of the movie in terms of both the visuals and the story being told, in terms of how the universe is created, how Celestials are born, and why the Deviants and Eternals were created in the first place. And I like that anytime you see Arsharam on screen, especially near the end of the movie when he's just hovering near Earth, I actually like the tiny detail that he's so big that he generates his own gravity field, where you actually see asteroids surrounding him. I thought that was a nice detail. Another aspect of the movie I liked is how the movie does a bait and switch in regards to Cersei's love life, because at the very beginning of the movie it's established that she and Icarus were an item, but eventually broke up. Fast forward to present day, we see that she's currently in a relationship with a man named Dan Whitman, who in actuality is the Black Knight. And I thought the movie was going to do one of those things where it was going to use the character of Dan Whitman to be the audience surrogate character in relation to having him interacting with all the Eternals. And not only that, I thought the movie was also going to have this dumb love triangle between him, Cersei, and Icarus. Thankfully, the film doesn't go in that direction, because we only see Dan for the first maybe 10 minutes of the movie, and we don't see him again until the last 5 minutes of the movie. So it's good that they didn't do the love triangle, nor have him be the audience surrogate character of the movie. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the special effects. And I know a lot of people had problems with the CGI in this, other than some particle effects for certain characters, or even the points of time where you have certain characters float in space and you see their hair floating. Those I had problems with, but other than that, I thought the CGI in general looked pretty good. Sure, I think it's standard for a MCU movie, but I thought it looked fine for what it was. Another aspect of this movie I liked are the Deviants themselves that the Eternals fight throughout the movie, for a couple of reasons. Reason number one, I actually like most of their designs, since they range from looking like modern day animals that we know of, with some exaggerated details such as a wolf, a cheetah, and bear, to some that look like a creature, a monster ripped out of some mythology like a minotaur or a dragon. And I also love the texture of their skin, where it doesn't really look like skin, it looks more like human muscle fibers with some feathered like features, depending on the deviant itself. And on top of that, I actually think they're kind of refreshing as far as villains are concerned, in that sense where they're not there to take over the world or destroy life as we know it. They're just creatures relying on natural instinct. Sure, I have a problem with them, which I'll discuss later, but I actually do find the Deviants refreshing as far as Marvel villains are concerned. Another aspect of the movie I really appreciate is the overall standalone nature of the movie itself, in that sense where, even though it is a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you really don't need to watch every single movie to understand this particular one. Sure, they make some references to some past Marvel movies, but they're not too heavy-handed like how certain other Marvel movies rely way too much on continuity. And in some ways, this is perhaps the most standalone installment of the MCU since 2008's The Incredible Hulk. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the pacing to it, because it's not like several other past Marvel movies where they're very fast-paced. Eternals is deliberately slow-paced. And I think that worked to the movie's advantage, since it really allowed a lot of time for you to get to know some of these characters, the relationship they have with each other, what the proper stakes are, and when to utilize their powers during an action scene. Sure, this does kind of lead to a problem later on, which I will discuss later, and I think by having the movie move at a slower pace, it also syncs up better with the more serious tone that Eternals has going for it in comparison to several of the past MCU installments. Another aspect of this movie I liked is how the director uses the science fiction genre within the movie itself, because we've had several MCU movies that are science fiction based, like Guardians of the Galaxy, but whereas Guardians of the Galaxy is very much in line with other sci-fi movies such as Star Wars or even Flash Gordon, where it's more of a sci-fi fantasy in that sense, where we see our main cast of characters interacting with a science fiction setting in which they take for granted, because the movie itself is focused more on the fantastical aspects of that universe while telling a simple good versus evil story. Whereas the Eternals, on the other hand, have our characters taking the actual science aspect of the setting more seriously and tells a story that's more in the gray area as opposed to being a simple good versus evil story. And to add on top of that, the Eternals definitely feels more like a throwback to early 1960s sci-fi in that sense, where it's a lot more deliberate with its pacing, the serious tone, and for a good chunk of the movie, it does consist of nothing but characters having conversations with each other in regards to having conversations revolve around either them explaining science terminologies or having philosophical conversations. Eternals definitely does that here, since despite the Eternals themselves not being fully human, they definitely serve as heightened metaphors for the human condition by having the Eternals themselves ponder about their own existence in regards to their own morality, philosophy, nature, the relationship between each other, the humans, the Celestials, life itself, resulting in some members of the Eternals having an existential crisis. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the director of Chloe Zhao, most likely mispronouncing that, because up to this point in her career, Eternals is her overall fourth movie she's ever directed, with the first three movies consisting of three independent movies, ranging from 2015's Songs My Brother Taught Me, 2017's The Writer, to her most well-known work, 2020's Nomadland. And as I mentioned earlier, before she ever directed Eternals, most of her movies were predominantly independent movies and looked very down-to-earth from what little research I have done on them. And seeing that her overall fourth movie is this gigantic superhero blockbuster, I can respect her trying to flex her muscles and directing something that's outside her comfort zone. However, my problem with her directing style in regards to Eternals is her inspiration behind it, because in one interview she stated that she took a lot of inspiration from the 2013 Zack Snyder movie Man of Steel, a movie that's very divisive among people, where you either have one group of people who say it's one of the best superhero movies ever made because it's a more serious take on Superman, or you got the other half who say it's one of the worst superhero movies ever made because it doesn't represent Superman whatsoever. As for my overall thoughts on Man of Steel are that I'm somewhere in the middle, where I don't love it, I don't hate it. I honestly think Man of Steel is just an okay movie. Sure, it's got some awesome action scenes and I love the music, but I thought every other aspect of the movie, from its pacing, character writing, story, and narrative structure, to be a mess. And why she used Man of Steel as an inspiration for Eternals, I will not understand, because to me, Man of Steel is just a very middle-of-the-road movie, and there are clearly better superhero movies out there to take inspiration from. And what makes it worse is you can see the Man of Steel influence in the movie itself. And I'm not just referring to the Icarus character, neither. I'm referring to the way the story is structured, the way the characters kind of talk to each other, among many other motifs I noticed this movie had in common with Man of Steel. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the costume design. At least the hero costumes that you see the Eternals wear periodically throughout the movie. On the one hand, you can tell that there was a lot of effort into making these costumes look as good as much as possible. My problem with it is that, with the exception of the costumes that Ajax and Athena wear throughout the movie, the costumes that all the other Eternals wear look nearly identical identical to each other. With the exception of the color scheme, I wish that the costume designs that the other Eternals had looked a bit more unique from each other, like the costumes that Ajax and Athena wear when you see them in their costumes. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the acting, because on the one hand, a lot of people describe the acting in this movie to be very dull and lifeless, which is very understandable given that you really want your actors to give really good emotive performances for their characters. But at the same time, I think having the cast of actors give these dull and lifeless performances actually makes sense to their characters, given that none of them are human, because they're artificial life forms created by Arsharam. And second, given that they've been on planet Earth for thousands of years, they probably have seen and done everything, so they're most likely bored themselves. So I think having the actors give these dull and lifeless performances to these characters actually makes sense within the movie, narratively speaking. Now, in terms of what I disliked about the movie, the first few problems I have with the movie are nitpicks, one of them being the humor. Because the movie doesn't really have that much in the way of humor, but when the movie does attempt to make a joke or two, the jokes, on top of not being funny, honestly just feel really out of place within the context of the movie. It just feels as if one of the producers went, okay, we need a funny joke here and a funny joke there. But thankfully, the movie doesn't really attempt to make jokes all that often, but when they do occur, they stick out like a sore thumb. Another nitpick I have with the movie is the point in time where we have a little kid character calling Icarus Superman. I just find that to be so odd, given that here's a Marvel movie that's acknowledging a DC property, you know, Marvel's rival when it comes to the comic book industry. But like I said earlier, the director did take a lot of inspiration from Man of Steel. So it's possible that the little Superman joke in this was meant to serve as a homage or reference to Man of Steel. But long story short, having that Superman joke in the movie just took me out of the movie for a brief second. Now, in terms of the actual problems I have with the movie, the first one, hilariously enough, revolves around Thanos. Because this movie unintentionally makes Thanos out to be the hero during Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. Because if you remember his motivation, he wanted to wipe out half of all life in the universe so that no other civilization could suffer the same fate that his people suffered through, which was extinction. And even though we understand his motivation, the way he goes about it is very horrific. Now, fast forward to this movie, it's established that the way a Celestial is born is by having the Celestials plant a seed inside every single planet. And over the course of billions of years, the population of that planet feeds the seed of the Celestial, allowing the Celestial to grow until it's ready to destroy said planet in the process. Which means that Thanos delayed the birth of the Celestial Tiamat. But because Avengers Endgame retconned the events of Avengers Infinity War, that means that the Celestial Tiamat is going to awaken, destroying Earth in the process. Then you have the whole mid-credit scene with Thanos' brother Eros, aka Star Fox, but I'm not gonna get into that. Now, another problem I have with the movie is a really common problem with the Marvel movies, that being the villain. Although the villain problem that this movie has is a little different than the typical villain problem that most MCU movies have. Because the problem with most villains in an MCU movie are that they are very underdeveloped, not really memorable, and aren't really the most faithful depiction of their counterpart from the comics. With this movie, on the other hand, it goes into Spider-Man 3 territory where it has multiple villains, but doesn't really seem to know who's the main villain. Because when you look at the advertising to this movie, it looks as if the Deviants are the main villains of the movie, and for the first third, they definitely are the main villains. But then during the second act of the movie, when we have Cersei communicating with Arsharam, the Prime Celestial, and we learn that he's the one that's not only responsible for the creation of the Deviants, but he also created the Eternals to fix his mistake that is the Deviants. And we also learn the process of how a Celestial is born, which results in the destruction of an entire planet, kind of making the Celestials in question villains in their own right. But then during the last third of the movie, it's revealed that Icarus is the real villain of the entire movie. because his whole motivation is that he's very loyal to the Celestials and wants to continue their work, and is trying to prevent the other Eternals from killing Tiamat. That results in the same mistake that Spider-Man 3 made with its villains, which are that it has three distinct villains, but it can't decide which villain should be the main villain of the movie. Honestly, if they had the Deviants be the main villains of the movie, I think that would have been good and in some ways refreshing. Now sure, I'm not familiar with the way the Deviants are depicted in the comics, but I actually like their depiction in the movie because they're not full-fledged characters. They're just creatures that rely on natural instinct and are willing to do anything to survive. And maybe have it be revealed that this particular group of deviants have evolved over several thousand years to a point where they're semi-intelligent and they have some motivation to kill off the Eternals for the sole purpose of survival. I actually think that would have worked out perfectly fine. That way the movie could have been this sci-fi horror movie about this group of immortals getting hunted by these monsters. I think that would have worked out much better than what we ended up with. Another nitpick I have with the movie is the way it actually begins with that opening text crawl, because a lot of these Marvel movies either don't have opening narration, or if they do, it's usually very clunky. But this is the first Marvel movie that opened with a text crawl, and I started thinking you literally could have had either Salma Hayek's character of Ajax or even the Celestial Arsharam do narration over the opening sequence of that opening text crawl, and it would have got the job done either way. And I also feel that the opening text crawl was very unnecessary. You could have just began the movie with the Eternals waking up to fight the Deviants on Earth in prehistoric times, and I think that would have been fine. Another problem that I have with the movie is the soundtrack, because the soundtrack, with the exception of the music that plays when you either have Ajax or Cersei talking to Arsharam, other than the music playing during those tidbits, the entire soundtrack in general is really forgettable, because it sounds like music that was comprised to every other Marvel movie. Or when they're not playing music that was created for the movie and they're playing third-party music, it's just really distracting and feels so out of place. And I felt that the points in time when you had the movie play these third-party soundtracks, such as Pink Floyd's Time, it didn't really mesh well with the movie's tone, in my opinion. Another problem I have with the movie is the way the story is structured, because there are points in time where it cuts back and forth between having the characters in the modern day fighting off the deviants that had just reawakened, and sometimes it just cuts back to events that occurred in the past, and there's no rhyme or reason in terms of how we go from the present to the past, or cut from the past to the present. Because when the scenes do play back to back to back, it's very jarring to watch. Because the movie is very fast-paced, and it doesn't really allow certain scenes to take their time to flourish from one period of time to another. And this is also one of those cases where, because this movie had so much content in terms of story, characters, and ideas, that I think having the Eternals be a movie was a mistake. I think it would have been more beneficial if the Eternals was a TV show as opposed to a movie, because at least with a TV show you can have the time to develop your characters' core concept themes and have the story be better paced through a medium such as television as opposed to the movie. And I could see the Eternals working as a TV show where you could have the first episode take place when they first arrive on Earth, and then next episode takes place during their time in Babylon. We see them fight some deviants, and basically every episode takes place at a different point in time in the past until you get to maybe halfway through the season that takes place during the present. I think that would have worked out a lot better than what we ended up with. Another problem I have with the movie are the points in time where the Eternals make this rule where it's established we cannot take part in any human affairs, yet there's clearly points in time where the Eternals do indeed take part in human affairs, breaking their own rule. Now sure, not every single Eternal does it, but this also raises another problem with the Eternals. Now, as mentioned a few seconds ago, they can't take part in human affairs unless if a deviant is involved. Yet, you have all of the events that occur throughout the MCU in which humans aren't involved with, such as the battle between the Asgards and the Frost Giants in the first Thor movie, or the Kree-Skrull War in Captain Marvel, or the points in time where the Chitauri invaders, like, you couldn't tell me the Eternals couldn't fight off those those kind of threat too. But that all said, I think their biggest offender for quote unquote not taking part in human affairs and then breaking that rule is by literally giving early man tools and knowledge to help them build human civilization as we know it. Is that not breaking the rule of we do not take part in human affairs? Another problem that I have with the movie revolves around the character of Makari, the Eternal who can move at superhuman speed. Because sometime around the release of the movie, I remember seeing a lot of articles stating that because of this particular character, who is not only the first deaf superhero within the MCU, but the actress playing Makari is also deaf herself, apparently a lot of people started taking up sign language. And this really bugged me because why did this character inspire so many people to take up sign language? This just confused me because, no joke, the first time I ever saw this movie, and we have the Eternals reunite with Makari during the last third of the movie, I'm not gonna lie, I straight up forgot Makari was even a character in this movie because she had so little impact on the narrative as a whole. Seriously, other than taking part in the final battle, she does nothing for a good majority of the movie, and she's not even one of the main characters. She's not even a support character, she's just a side character that joins the final fight. And the reason why this bugs me so much, with A Quiet Place franchise, one of the main characters of the movie is Reagan, who is a deaf teenager played by an actress who is also deaf. In Godzilla vs. Kong, you have Jira, who is also played by a deaf actress. And the thing they both have in common are that the characters they play, on top of being deaf, are main central characters that do have an impact on the narrative of their movies. Yet, you never saw anybody take up sign language because of neither movie. But for some reason, when this movie came out, people were suddenly interested in taking sign language for a character who's not even the main character, but had very little impact on the narrative. Why was this such a big deal? I don't get it. And for the final problem I have with the movie, has to do with Ajax, because the entire reason why all the Eternals get together in the first place has to do with her death, and the movie treats Ajax as if she was the emotional core of the entire team. Now sure, she was the leader of the Eternals, and she definitely had parting words of wisdom for each member, but I never really found myself to be all that attached to her character. Because Ajax never to me felt like an actual character, she felt more like a plot device for the Eternals to get back together. But even then, I never really believed that all of the Eternals were that emotionally attached to Ajax to begin with, despite her being the leader of the group. So for my final verdict of Eternals, the movie is really ambitious, but in a bad kind of way. Because the movie tries to be this thought-provoking sci-fi epic, but collapses under the weight of its own ambition because it's trying to introduce new concepts and characters into the MCU, but doesn't take the time to fully develop said concepts and characters, resulting in a movie that honestly would have made for a better TV show than an actual movie itself. So overall, Eternals is a movie that bit off more than it could chew, but it's a movie I ultimately respect because it tries to be a little different from your average MCU movie. And before I give my final rating, what did everybody else have to say about Eternals? So, I know that the numbers show that the movie got mixed reception across the board, but as I stated earlier, this is one of those installments that is often considered to be one of the worst. Personally, I think Eternals was just okay at the end of the day, and so for my final rating of Eternals, I give it a 3 out of 5. So, how do you feel about the reception Eternals got at the time? And see you later.